It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This is Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., delivering the decision of the Supreme Court case of Buck versus Bell, which decided that a state statute permitting compulsory sterilization of the unfit for the protection and health of the state did not violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Welcome to Beneath the Surface. I'm your host, Haydn Hanna. Today, I'm talking about eugenics with Dr. Tom Malcomson. Dr. Tom Malcomson is a professor at George Brown University. And Tom, we're going to be talking about some darker stuff, so I thought to introduce you rather than give you the normal drab kind of academic introduction. I'd read one of your reviews on ratemyprofessor.com because it's more telling, I thought. Tom is honestly a great prof. You won't ever want to miss his lectures. He's such a character. He's absolutely hilarious and has amazing stories to tell. There's no ambiguity when it comes to tests and assignments. And if you don't understand something, he won't hesitate to spend an hour explaining it to you. Psych 102 was my favorite class. Smiley face emoji. So Tom, we're going to talk about eugenics. So perhaps you can give a rough definition for what eugenics is, or what it came to be known as.
Eugenics was a term coined by Francis Galton in 1885. And it basically said that since humans are determined largely based on heredity by the gene pool from which they come, that we ought to be manipulating that pool in order to create the best kinds of people. People who will benefit and construct society in a good, positive way. And that we could use those same ideas to eliminate or to remove people who are a drain on society or who interfere in very negative ways with society. And Galton actually proposed 2 different types of eugenics. A positive eugenics, which would be a way to enhance and encourage people to have more children if those people were deemed to be healthy, mentally, physically, emotionally healthy, and that they would be obviously contributing to society. The negative eugenics was, so an example of the positive would be tax credits. The more children you have in a healthy, good family, you'd get more money off your taxes. You might get freer access to higher education. There was a variety of things that was proposed. The negative eugenics is that you prevent people deemed to be deficient or less than fully human, as they would actually come to think. You would stop them from reproducing. And one way would be to house them in large institutions, men in one, women in another, so that there couldn't be any breeding, or to sterilize. To prevent them from, again, reproducing. The ultimate negative eugenics, of course, is to kill people. And that is we saw that in the Nazi Germany, where the ultimate end to eugenics was played out.
Right. So Sir Francis Galton was English, and he died before the Nazis came to power. So this was a movement that predates the Nazis, even though most people kind of associate it with Nazism. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about the history pre-Nazi Germany, about how this kind of ideology spread and how it moved, and then maybe ultimately how Hitler came to know about it?
All right. So Galton is the cousin of Charles Darwin, and as you said, he was a wealthy upper-class Englishman. He had higher education. He had the benefit of world travel and a lot of money. And so he went out and saw different parts of the world as he kind of spent his youth. And his cousin and they obviously talked a bit, but they obviously weren't overly close. But he read Darwin's book on the origin of species. And although in that book, Darwin purposefully did not apply his understanding of the evolutionary theory to humans, not in that book. He waited another 10 years to crank that one out. But Galton, in reading the origin of species, immediately applied it to humans. He saw, well, it was an epiphany. And so he began writing and researching and trying to figure the statistical record for humans in terms of who were the best and who weren't, and how you could develop tests to weed that information out. It's interesting because Galton was an incredible mind. He was a brilliant mathematician. And the story is that he counted everything. He actually kept little things in his pocket, pieces of paper. And he would put a thumbtack on his thumb, and he would actually press holes in the paper in different positions as he counted all sorts of things that he encountered in his day. And then he would analyze these numbers, attempting to understand the patterns that were in humans. And this is important because this statistical element actually is throughout the eugenics movement. Some of the most significant statistical techniques we have actually were developed by eugenicists so that they could divide and separate out and measure human weakness and human strength. So he did that. He tried to convince other people to do it, but by 1900 there really wasn't a lot of people interested in England about it. He'd published some books. He'd gone around talking about it very clearly, and he kind of sort of stepped away from the stage, and he actually said that this wasn't going to go anywhere right now. But there was a man named Pearson in England who also was a significant statistician, who gave us the Pearson correlation test, actually. And he completely believed that Galton was right. And he was a university professor at the University of London, and he was fairly powerful. And he began creating all sorts of activity to measure qualities of humans in England. And he was particularly concerned about the poor, the lower class. And he began to suggest that the lower class were hereditarily deficient, and that's why they were lower, destined always to produce more poverty-ridden families. And that the upper class, and indeed most elements in the upper class, but certainly the middle class, who were people who were able to rise up, were clearly hereditarily superior. So he wrote about this. Galton had suggested this earlier. And he actually got Galton to come in to some public presentations. And in the early 1900s in England, it seemed to catch fire. And he actually Galton gave a presentation in 1905, where he literally laid out the program for eugenics. He talked about doing more family studies. He talked about trying to accurately measure all kinds of human characteristics so that you can then weed out people. He also said, and this is one of the interesting parts from a historian, he said, you're going to have to get the public out there to see this as a religion, to see this and have a faith that this is correct and be completely devoted to engaging in it. And if you look at any other eugenic movement, they basically take his 5 points and they run with them. And it's their goal to do better testing, to weed people out, to teach people about how to lower the incidence of individuals who are deemed to be defective or deficient in some way. So Galton's speech becomes the agenda for most of the other eugenic activity that I've seen and read about or studied, and it really starts to take off. Now in England, it doesn't get the traction that it gets in other places, oddly enough. Although they do pass in, I believe it was 1913, they do pass a mental health measure that actually stayed until the early 1960s, where if you were seen to be deficient, you were basically confined for life, and there was no way getting out. And that was clearly a eugenic activity that was put into the law based on eugenic political activity to get that in there. But there was no sterilization law ever in Britain, and it didn't seem to have a great strong following as it did in other places. However, at the same time, in places like Canada and United States and across Europe, the world was changing. It was coming from the 19th into the 20th century. There was incredible development in technology. There was very, very strong strides forward in the area of medicine and the understanding of human anatomy and how things actually worked, how systems, biological systems actually functioned. So with these advances in medicine and understanding human physiology and that, and anatomy, and the changes in science overall, there was a sort of a tendency in the larger population in academia to look to science for solutions to the current problems, social issues, dilemmas of the human experience. And this is, again, it's a shift away from a religious answer. It's a shift away from some of the charity options where you just sort of take care of people. Now science is saying, well, we can do more than take care. We can fix, we can solve, we can change the way things are. And so in Canada, United States, and in Europe, various scientists, like you could say, began to look to how to do this kind of science with humans. And Galton and Pearson's ideas on eugenics rang true for some of them. Now, interestingly enough, some of the first people to actually turn to human eugenics were from the American Breeders Association, who were, their concern was breeding better cattle, horses, pigs, and chickens and things. And they literally began to consider that you could do this with humans. You simply, since we're biological, and because of this whole evolutionary theory now that's from Darwin that is pretty well widely accepted, people are beginning to do all kinds of work with, thinking about the world with that frame of mind. These people began to suggest that that's what should happen. In the United States, it was particularly led by a guy named Charles Davenport, who was a member of the American Breeders Association. He was a PhD in biology, and he wanted to study human heredity and to weed out problems, to stop people from creating a society that he would see would be over time burdened unnecessarily by people with deficiencies. And so he did, and he gathered around him a large number of researchers, and he also gathered around him a number of people who were willing to fund research like this. The Roosevelt Institution, the Carnegie Institution, and there's a late railroad man, I think it was Harrison, and his widow had a large amount of money that Davenport and the others basically went and said, this is the work we're doing, and these people thought this was good work to invest in, and so they gave them lots of money. That made them, in a sense, able to broadcast their message to a wide and far because of their affiliation with these large organizations. They also got people to listen to them more. They wrote a lot, and they began to write not only academic books, but things for the public. They began to write articles in newspapers and magazines that people would read. They began to encourage others. They began to teach these courses on eugenics in universities. Not everyone who took the course bought into it, of course, but enough did, who went out then and did their own work. So in the United States, it caught. And it caught for a variety of reasons. One, I think it is the science and technological advancement that America was feeling. There were challenges that America was undergoing at the time. There was a large immigration movement into the United States between 1890 and around 1920. And these people were coming not from Northern Europe, which was traditionally the spot people came to North America from, but they were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and they were coming from Asia. And they were very different from the people that were there first, and their language issues were more complex. They seemed to have a very different educational background, and they tended to keep together in what one can understand is community support, help each other out. This was seen by many middle class and upper class Americans as a threat. And so unfortunately, in a society that was already leaning towards racism with its own racism towards black Americans, they applied that same kind of biological understanding to these new people. And so eugenics actually began to be used to say that these new immigrants were inferior, they were deficient. Lots of press on that. They seemed to take every possible chance that they could to show anything that an immigrant would have done that would have been perhaps not appropriate was always seen to be as a biological cause or a root, and they were shown off as flags in a sense. The eugenicists did sort of take over Ellis Island in New York, where a lot of immigrants were funneled through. They did all sorts of IQ testing, and they published those results, which again showed that the new immigrants were intellectually inferior to Americans. Now there's problems with that, of course. The IQ tests they were using were very poor. We would not accept them at all today. And at first they were actually asking people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, they were asking the IQ tests, they were asking them in English, and these people didn't speak English. So, I mean, how well are you going to do? And when they interpreted the tests and put them into their languages, again, the kind of information that the IQ test was asking was not the kind of information that these people would have been privy to in their educational system or in their daily life experience. So again, they were culturally not correct. But these people doing the test did not consider those issues. So this body of evidence, not heavily critiqued or examined from other points of view other than that this supports eugenics, it got a lot of traction all over America. And people began very early to practice negative eugenic techniques, and that was primarily sterilization. They did that shortly after really the turn of 1900. They began to at first sterilize prisoners. People who were in prison for various crimes would be allowed to leave prison if they allowed themselves to be sterilized. And states passed some laws on that. They were a little sloppy. Some of the prisoners protested against this, and some of them went to court, and actually the laws were struck down by the High Court. Which, when you start off with the quote today, that's the quote that comes from the trial case that brought forward a new type of law that would make sterilization acceptable to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And that law was created specifically to please the Supreme Court. And it was created by a guy named Harry Laughlin, one of the people who worked with Davenport. And Laughlin was a total eugenicist in every way, did as much as he could in every area to restrict people he felt were inferior, which was a lot of people actually. And he reviewed all the laws prior to, probably by 1920, he reviewed all the laws and he saw where the problems were. So he sat down and he wrote out what a law would have to be to pass muster at the Supreme Court. That the method used to sterilize was not deemed to be cruel and unusual punishment, that the person got due notice, that the person was able to challenge the order in court. So the law, he wrote this instruction out. He actually sent the instructions. It was a book he published. He sent them to all the state legal areas, all the people who made laws for all the states in the United States. He sent them a copy and asked them basically to take a look at it. And what he wanted was, he wanted one of them to actually make a law and then test it. And that happened in Virginia with Carrie Buck. And she was purposely selected to test that law. Her mother had been confined to the same epileptic and feeble-minded colony, that's what it was called, in Virginia. She was confined, and she had a daughter. The daughter wasn't confined. The daughter lived on the outside, didn't live in the institution. And they were tested by people sent from Davenport's eugenic activity center on Long Island, Cold Spring, Long Island. And this guy came down and tested Emma, which was Carrie's mom, and Carrie. Emma's mother was labeled as an imbecile. Carrie was labeled as a moron, which is, in the terms of the rating at that time, was just below normal functioning. And the baby, Vivian, wasn't rated. They couldn't come up with a name for her. When you read through the testimony in the various court cases, the social worker really can't name what the child looks odd, is the best she comes up with. And the Easterbrook, the man sent from Davenport's center at Cold Spring, he did some very strange kinds of attention tests, basically, very weird. And he pronounced her a moron, too. So, actually, Justice Holmes is wrong. He said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Well, they weren't. They were an imbecile, a moron, and we're not quite sure. So we have to go back and understand that this man, this Holmes, and many of the other people on the Supreme Court at the time, they saw life as pretty predatory. Indeed, Holmes at one point said that, you go out into life and you fight the fox and you survive. It's a cold world. And you either survive or you get eaten. And people who can't survive, people who can't take care of themselves, should be eaten. So this man, although it's not a complete eugenic, a clear eugenic statement, it is clearly a eugenic frame of mind that he had. And he clearly did not understand the supposed scientific testimony that, you have an imbecile, you have a moron, there's a different level, different potential between these people. He just saw them all the same. So he actually pushed aside the supposed scientific evidence to exert his own personal bias. Now, Holmes, of course, is a hero in the United States. He's seen as actually the man who did all sorts of good justice work for the lowly, for the downtrodden person.
And this is, you mean currently?
Yeah.
Currently
oh, yeah. Yeah. He's a hero. He was a hero in his lifetime too. And yet this is the hallmark. This is the one that people keep coming back to, where he blindly ignores the evidence in front of him, the testimony, and declares these people as the lowest level of rating for a human being. And they don't really care about their having a child or not, which again is an assumption he's made without asking anyone. It's an interesting comment about, again, that level of society and how they saw advancement, and that the eugenics just fit right into it. I mean, he totally embraced this idea, although I don't think he understood it at all, really.
Okay.
But after that announcement in 1927, that's when the states, the real sterilization began in the United States, and tens of thousands of people were sterilized under the kinds of laws that Laughlin had basically outlined in his book as to what they needed to do. It really opened the floodgates.
Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to remind you that Beneath the Surface is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. The link can be found in the description. Now back to my conversation with Dr. Tom Malcomson.
So in Canada, we don't have a Davenport or a Laughlin. We have people who talk about eugenics. I mean, the first eugenics conversation that we're aware of took place out in Halifax. It was a huge speech given by a man. Part of it was on eugenics. And we have eugenic movements across Canada, but they really only in the province of Alberta and British Columbia are they strong enough. And indeed, in the province of Alberta, the party that advocates it becomes the party that runs the province. We have laws of sterilization. And those laws, they come into effect in the late 1920s into the 1930s, and they stay in effect until the early 1970s. 72 is when Alberta finally ended that law. And they were sterilizing people up until the end. Not many in the last couple of years after a lot of bad press, but in the 1950s and 60s in Alberta, per capita, they sterilized more people during that time than America did, with the exclusion of California, because California is the #1 state for sterilization under eugenic laws, huge numbers. In Ontario, the movement had a number of people that spoke for it. Clark, the psychiatrist Clark, who the Clark Institute's named after, was promoted eugenics. There was McMurphy, the female doctor who was worked under the Ministry of Health as one of their consultants. She actually, let me change the name there. I'm having a block on the name. McMurchie, that's it, McMurchie. Helen McMurchie. And Helen McMurchie in Ontario was Ontario's bulldog on eugenics. And she wanted the province to have more institutions to isolate people and sterilization. Because of the finances, the province couldn't build as many institutions as she asked, though they built a few of them. And because of the amount of Catholic people living in the province of Ontario, no political party would take on a sterilization platform because they were worried about losing votes. In Quebec, the movement was basically confined to McGill University. And outside of McGill, eugenics was a really bad word, and there were a number of French-Canadian lay people, as well as clergy, but many lay people who wrote against eugenics and saw it as a racist attack on the Quebecois, the Quebec people, the French-Canadian people, and the nature of their families and that. And so it was an academic discussion at McGill, that's about it. There's very little known about what else happened in Canada. There was a law tried to be passed in Manitoba, but it was defeated. We don't know anything about Saskatchewan, and even the history of Ontario is something we need to write about. Now, the big one, of course, is Nazi Germany. And in Nazi Germany, what happens is there's an acceptance of Darwin's theory of evolution early. By 1890, there's people writing about it. One German biologist is Haeckel, and he wrote a lot about it. He actually translated a lot of Darwin's work. And there were societies that took it on, like in America, and they studied it. And there were sort of two streams in Germany. There was one that was more like Britain and a bit like Canada. It looked at people not based on class or race so much, but based on measurements, intelligence measurements, issues of physical disability, mental breakdown. And they began to want to use eugenics to eliminate that group, cut them down. There was another section that was extremely racist. They accepted all what I said in that other group, but they believed in the Aryan myth somewhat, and they believed that Germany was at racial risk, and they saw eugenics as a way to, again, breed better Germans and not allow other people in. That was the group that Hitler was associated with. He read their literature. We know that he read some of the books. We have his library, or sense parts of his library. Their work, their thinking shows up in his book Mein Kampf. very much. He says very clearly to kill off 100,000 of the weakest born would be a good thing for the society. He actually says it in the book. He was very clear all along that he would engage in extreme negative eugenics when he came to power. Right away, he created a sterilization law that was non-voluntary. And when he could, in 1939, in the smoke of war, he engaged in a euthanasia program of eugenics, where he actually started to kill off people who were physically disabled, mentally disabled, emotionally disabled. He started starting with children and working his way up to adults. He included frail elderly, and there's even some evidence that the movement, even after he publicly said he wasn't doing it anymore, or that it wasn't happening anymore, it continued, of course, that they even began to euthanize under the idea that they can't do anything with these people and they'll never contribute to society, severely wounded soldiers coming home from the Eastern Front. So this, Nazi Germany, as I said before, really is it's sort of the ultimate end to eugenics, where if you play through on the idea, you encourage the people that you deem to be good, you encourage them to have more children, the people who you have assessed in some way based on some set of values or whatever, to be not as good, not fully human, you eliminate them by not allowing them to reproduce, and ultimately by killing them.
And I read also that Hitler was inspired by what was happening in the United States as well. So he didn't just kind of come up with this on his own. It does go historic. There is a historical connection.
Absolutely. The Germans came to international eugenics conferences in England and in America. Even after the Nazis took over, they sent Nazi doctors engaging in eugenic activity to these international conferences. They read reports. They loved Laughlin's law so much, they actually, other than being able to say no, the Germans took his law and used every part of it. They just didn't allow people to say no. So once you were, you were told you were going to be sterilized, they used the same methods the Americans did, which were seen to be less invasive or less painful, which is actually questionable, but they gave the person written notice. I mean, they had a court, but the court was fixed. Once you were in, it was done. You couldn't say no. Indeed, they gave Laughlin an honorary PhD in 1937. Now, he couldn't go, which is interesting because Laughlin had a severe case of epilepsy. And of course, this is one of the groups of people that he wanted to eliminate, which is, again, absolutely bizarre. This man was so set against people who had the disorder that he had, that he kept secret. He would not show that with anyone. And in Canada, the Canadian Medical Association actually praised the sterilization work done by the Nazis in 1937 on one of their issues. So yeah, there was a lot of feedback back and forth. Hitler knew what was going on here, and most people here knew what Hitler was doing.
That's interesting what you were saying with Laughlin having epilepsy, and that's one of the conditions that he was so set against. I mean, you could read a lot of sort of psychological implications of that, like self-hatred or
self-loathing.
Self-loathing. Does that sort of do you see that in other areas of the eugenic movement as well? That kind of interpretation of self-loathing, or they're scared of something, or
somewhat. I mean, I've read some people who've mentioned this and just leave it for you to think about this. Now, this is a man who suffered from an epilepsy, and it was uncontrolled, and it got to be very, very bad by 1937. It was limiting his ability to actually be out. And yet, at that time, up until the time he died, he never, ever, ever stopped pushing the eugenic agenda. And people who were epileptic were high on his list to eliminate them from the world. If you look at others, and there's other people too involved in the system that also had disabilities or interesting emotional problems, Hitler being one of the probably the clearest examples as well. He had some physical issues that would have made him marked out for elimination, or at least for sterilization. So did Goebbels, his right hand in terms of propaganda guy. And yet they seem to overlook that. Again, it's an interesting dilemma when you confront these people who when you read that they're so strong about this and so sure of it, but it's for everyone else, not for me. But they would be one of the ones taken into this system, clearly.
Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. So today, what sort of things like this are going on today, and maybe you could touch on what is kind of the common string between these ideas that go on today, and maybe some of the differences as well.
Okay. So in terms of the past and today, well, it's interesting because there's a book just out now by Steven Pinker in which he looks at a number of global issues, and he paints a much more positive picture than what we sometimes get from the news media. And in the book, he actually mentions eugenics, and he suggests that eugenics is finished. It's over. It's done. It ended after the war with the horrors of what the Nazis did. It made it not reputable to do. So it's done. And he said that in the book. He says people who bring up the word eugenics or the name eugenics when they're talking about genetic engineering are simply, again, they're in a way misleading us, and they're just trying to stop an advance of a technology that he obviously sees as good. I would disagree. Now, I'm just a minor man, but I would disagree with him. I don't think it has disappeared. Eugenics hasn't stopped. Eugenics is the idea that some people are not good enough to be involved in life. They have some deficiency, some shortcoming, some element of who they are that is not acceptable. It's going to cost us too much money. It's a burden on people who have to take care of them. It leads to bad activity that tears down our great society. Humans should be better rather than weak, right? And we still have that, right? We have that where we now want to test, and indeed, the Canadian Medical Association does suggest that every pregnant woman is tested for Down's syndrome, and that the alternatives are then presented to them. And the alternative is have an abortion. Stop this life, because a Down's life, someone with Down syndrome, can't be good. It's not good enough. People are not in genetic counseling. From my understanding, they are not given the opportunity to talk to people who have a child with Down syndrome or a person with Down syndrome themselves, to see the humanity, to see the humanness that's there. And yes, there are struggles, and yes, it's rough and tough, and there is sacrifices to be had, to be made. But there's also potentials, and there's positive potentials here. And this doesn't get presented. Because again, there's a view somewhere, we won't actually say who, won't point fingers, but there's a view that underlies the genetic domain, that there's a good genetics and there's bad genetics, and the bad genetics are what we want to get rid of. Now, to say that, I would not want to say that all genetic work is bad, because perhaps there are things that we can do that can help people adjust to conditions. There are things that we can do that can prevent particular types of diseases that we might experience in our lives. But that might be an interesting thing to do. But to stop a life, to prevent life, to then cast the shadow, as you talk about it that way, cast the shadow upon all those who are born with these conditions, as maybe they shouldn't have been born, I think that's eugenics. And that's the evil of the eugenics still there.
So is it possible that, say Steven Pinker or other people who kind of believe that eugenics is no longer have a more narrow definition of eugenics than maybe the one you presented 2 or 3 minutes earlier. And what is the strength of this definition versus your definition?
They might again just want to look at the very pinpoint of that quasi-scientific notion, where they say because of heredity, which again the first eugenicists had no idea what heredity was created of, or how it worked or anything. They just talked about hereditary substance, germ plasm. Maybe that's the eugenics that they want us to think about, the one that actually talked about breeding people, but didn't understand how to do it. Whereas today, we understand a lot more about the human genes. We know a lot more than they did about how genetics works, although we are also clear that we don't know everything, and that in some ways it's far more complicated. Each level we get into, it's far more complicated than we had realized when trying to figure out the characteristics of humans and how it's genetically encoded. But there are over 2,000 different tests you can have to figure out what types of potential ways of being in this world might be in your genetic pool. For either a child that's still developing in the womb, or once you come out, you can have these tests done. That's a lot, and that, again, it's for me, it's the issue that's what you want to do, and what you want to do is you want to make better human beings and get rid of other human beings that you have decided are not good, and they're not good because they're not like what you think is normal or what you think is better. And the key here is what you think. These decisions are based on human values, not absolutes. And the values do shift, and the values do serve our own ends. And so I see that as eugenics.
So Mark Twain said that history sometimes doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Right, so
great.
So I thought that was a good way to sum that up. So
it does.
So yeah. The abortion thing is maybe it's not quite it's not locking people up in institutions and then sterilizing them and killing them, but it seems to have some sort of rhyme with the previous kind of eugenic history.
Yeah. And you can isolate people, keep people away from mainstream society, keep them poor, and shorten their lives that way. The war on poverty in the United States in the 70s and early 80s was really a mass sterilization effort of poor people. And there wasn't within the last couple of years, last 3 or 4 years, one of the state senators in the South, either Louisiana or Mississippi, actually wanted to bring forward a eugenic law again for people who were on social assistance, mothers who were on social assistance who had 2 children. If they want any more social assistance, they had to be sterilized. And that's pretty close to what the eugenicists were doing in other states at the beginning of the 20th century.
So as a historian, maybe you could just say a couple words on the importance of history in general, because some of these things happening today, like the selective abortion, it would be pretty hard to see those as eugenically motivated if you didn't have an understanding of what eugenics looked like in from the beginning of the 20th century onward. So maybe you'd just like to we'll finish up on that.
All right. So I would suggest that people need to know their history. That we need to know the history of our eras, the ones that came before us, because as humans, although we do change across time a little, we are not much unlike they were. We have the same kinds of ways of being. We have a human nature. And the human nature that I'm thinking about here is that human nature to separate out and divide people into groups, to see ourselves as one group and others as an outside group, and that has often led to very not good things happening when we begin to divide ourselves like that. If we know the history of those kinds of developments, then when they begin to come again, because we're humans and we go back to that, we can say, well, okay, this is not what we're going to do. We're going to stop this here. We're not going to take that next step. In this larger world today, I think we need to know the stories and the histories of the past as clearly as we can in order to prevent people lying to us and making us vote towards things that really are not the truth, or to believe things that aren't truthful. Because if you do know the history and someone starts telling you about what happened, if you know what happened and they're not matching your story, you can ask questions. And if they're lying, that lying will come out. If they have a different perspective, then you can explore that perspective together and figure out what the story is. If one of you is wrong or correct, or you need to blend things a bit, whatever. But you can't do that. You can't learn, you can't grow that stuff unless you know your past. And I think we live in dangerous times today for a number of reasons, and knowing our past might help us avoid some of the problems that we fell into before and harmed a lot of people.
Tom, thank you for talking to me today. It was a pleasure.
A pleasure. Thanks.
Right. Hey guys, thanks for listening. A reminder that Beneath the Surface is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you like this episode, you should consider becoming a patron on our Patreon page. I'm your host, Haydn Hanna, and I'll see you next time.